exploring our home away from home. The dogs are in the back. Let's go!
We just got back from our Great Smoky Mountain National Park trip. While there, we visited Cades Cove. Though geographically isolated, Cades Cove today is a popular tourist destination. A one-way, 11-mile paved loop around Cades Cove draws thousands of visitors daily. The 11 miles may take more than 4 hours to traverse and view the sights during tourist season. The cove receives approximately 5 million visitors per year, and it is the most popular destination in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. My hope for the cove was to spy a black bear, and I was lucky enough to see one. Don't worry, we were the recommended distance away. This picture is heavily cropped. This was the highlight of my entire week-long trip, although many enthusiasts make the trip for the abundant hiking, access, and the well-preserved 19th century homesteads. On most days, multiple deer can be seen in the meadows and woods throughout the cove. In addition to hiking and general sightseeing, horseback and bicycle riding are popular activities. Cades Cove is a broad, verdant valley surrounded by mountains and is one of the most popular destinations in the Great Smokies. It offers some of the best opportunities for wildlife viewing in the park. Large numbers of white-tailed deer are frequently seen, and sightings of black bear, coyote, groundhog, turkey, raccoon, skunk, and other animals are possible. Vehicle-free access along the Cades Cove Loop Road takes place each Wednesday from May 4th through September 28, 2022. On these days, the 11-mile loop can be enjoyed on foot or bicycle. Traffic is heavy during the tourist season in summer and fall and on weekends year-round. While driving the loop road, please be courteous to other visitors and use pullouts when stopping to enjoy the scenery or view wildlife. An inexpensive self-guiding tour booklet available at the entrance to the road provides a map and information about the cove. The valley has a rich history. For hundreds of years, Cherokee Indians hunted the Cades Cove, but archaeologists have found no evidence of major settlements. The first Europeans settled in the cove sometime between 1818 and 1821. By 1830, the population of the area had already swelled to 271. Cades Cove offers the widest variety of historic buildings of any area in the national park. The first stop on the Cove Loop is the John Oliver Cabin. This is one of over 80 historic buildings in the park. The collection is believed to be the largest of its kind in the East. John Oliver arrived in the cove prior to 1820 and bought this land in 1826. It remained in the family until the park was established more than 100 years later. Large families often lived in such small buildings. Exact arrangements differed from family to family. Usually, however, parents, infants, and daughters slept on the first floor, and sons slept in the loft. Not much except mules, muscles, simple tools, and neighborly help was needed to fell the trees, get them to the building site, and build the house. The round logs were scored along their length with a felling axe, then hewn with a broadaxe. The notched corners need no nails or pegs. Gravity holds them together. Chinks, which are open spaces between the logs, were filled with mud to seal out wind, rain, snow. The stone chimney is held together with mud mortar. The Primitive Baptist Church. Some of the earliest settlers established this church in 1827. A log building served their needs until this one replaced it in 1887. The church closed during the Civil War. Official church correspondence after the war explained it all. We, the Primitive Baptist Church of Blount County in Cades Cove, do show the public why we have not kept up our church meeting. It was on account of the rebellion, and we as Union people and the rebels was too strong here in Cades Cove. Our preacher was obliged to leave sometimes, and thank God we once more can meet. Some of the early settlers lie in the cemetery. The consolidated schools stood to the left of the road leading to the church. The Cades Cove Methodist Church. J.D. McCampbell, a blacksmith and carpenter, built this church in 115 days for $115. He later served many years as its minister. Methodists were not as numerous as Baptists in the Cove, but enough of them got together in the 1820s to establish the church in a log building that lasted until this one replaced it in 1902. The Civil War and Reconstruction divided the church, as it did other Methodist congregations. Dissidents formed the Hopewell Methodist Church on the opposite side of the cove. It no longer stands. Notice the church has two front doors. This usually indicates the church follows the custom of men sitting on one side and women on the other. But this church didn't follow that custom. The two doors are there because the church borrowed the building plans from another church that did divide its congregation by gender. The Cades Cove Missionary Baptist Church. A group of Baptists expelled from the Primitive Baptist Church because they favored missionary work formed this church in 1839. The church ceased to meet during the Civil War. It resumed activity after the war, but without members who had been Confederate sympathizers. This building dates from 1915. A Sunday school that started in the church in 1898 continued until the church closed in 1944. The Elijah Oliver Place. I didn't get to stop at this site. Elijah Oliver, son of John Oliver, whose cabin you saw earlier, was born in the Cove in 1824. After he married, he and his family moved out of the Cove before the Civil War. After the war, he bought this property and moved back in. In the time and place of this family, more buildings were required for living than now. With no refrigerator or freezer, they needed the spring house to keep milk and butter cool. They needed the smokehouse to store and preserve hams, shoulders, and side meat for an entire year. They ate mostly pork because it was easier to preserve than other meats. They needed the corn crib to store enough corn for grinding into meal until the next harvest. Having no automobile or motorized farm equipment, they needed horses or mules to pull plows, harrows, buggies, sleds, and wagons. And they needed a barn to shelter these animals, along with the cows that provided milk. Hay to feed them was stored in the barn loft. Water for drinking, cooking, bathing, and laundry had to be carried from the spring. No easy task. And this is the cabin. Buildings were made of logs until the 1870s because there was no nearby sawmill. The visitor center is open daily throughout the spring, summer, and fall. It is open most days during the winter, barring flood or flurry. Built in 1972, it is a place where visitors may obtain information and buy books, postcards, batteries, maps, guides, and other items. The blacksmith shop. Iron was essential in the Cove and in all of rural America in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the blacksmith was its master. Every farm community had a blacksmith. Some large farms had their own blacksmith shops. With his strong muscles and heavy hammer, the blacksmith shaped white-hot steel into the tools of living. Axes, adzes, draw knives and froes, bolts and bits, chains and hooks, the bull-tongue plow and the wagon tire. Iron from the fire is very malleable, capable of being shaped from one tool to another. A broken cross-cut saw can be remade into butcher knives. A worn-out hatchet can become a hammer, provided there is a blacksmith to perform the magic. LeQuire Cantilever Barn. Large barns were common in the Cove, where farmers needed shelter in the cold months for livestock they grazed in the mountains during the warm season. The overhang in cantilever barns, such as this one, provided shelter for the animals, as well as storage space for farm equipment. Cantilever construction, counterweighted overhanging beams, originated centuries ago in Europe. Mill race and dam, starting where the wooden flume dumps its load of water onto the top of the mill wheel. You can follow the path beside the flume to the earthen ditch and then continue beside the ditch to the mill dam and the mill pond beyond the dam. A water gate at the dam is open to send water down the mill race to the wheel. The John Cable Grist Mill. The grist mill is on its original site. Other historic buildings in this complex were brought from elsewhere in the park. John P. Cable bought land in the cove in the late 1860s. He built a water-powered grist mill and sawmill in about 1870. The same wheel provided power for both mills. It was a sash sawmill with a heavy reciprocating blade that cut a short distance into a log with each downward stroke. It was a relatively slow way to turn a log into lumber. Smokehouse. The smokehouse was where large sections of hogs were cured by smoking or salting and then stored for use until the next hog killing time, usually during a cold spell in November or December. The meat of deer or bear was not easily cured and was eaten fresh. People ate lots of chicken that was also eaten fresh. The Gregg Cable House. Les and Gregg bought an acre of land from John P. Cable in 1879 and built a small house on it with lumber sawed at Cable's mill. He later enlarged the house from time to time. He and his family lived in it and operated a store on the first floor. It is believed to be the first all-frame house in the Cove. In 1887, Rebecca Cable and her brother Dan Cable bought the house and the acre that their father had sold to Gregg 8 years earlier. They operated the store for about 8 years before selling their stock and merchandise, after which they used the building as a residence and boarding house. Dan and his wife fell ill, so Aunt Becky reared her brother's children, ran the boarding house, took care of cattle-raising chores, and lived a long and successful life. She owned more than 600 acres of land. She died in 1940 at the age of 96. After her death, the house was moved from its original site on the Forge Creek Road to this location. The corn crib. Corn was the most important crop in the Cove. People ground it into meal for making bread and for some of them to make moonshine. They fed it to mules, horses, hogs, and chickens. Corn shuckings sometimes were social events, where a fellow finding the red ear got to kiss the girl. The barn. This type of barn, with the drive-through, the center, and the stalls on each side, was more typical in East Tennessee than the cantilever barn. 2 men with pitchforks, one on a wagon load of hay in the drive-through and the other in the loft, could transfer hay to the loft in a short time. The hay was fed to draft animals and milk cows in the stalls below in the winter months when grass in the fields was poor. The drive-through sometimes served as storage place for farm equipment. The Henry Whitehead cabin. I also missed this one. Matilda Shields, Gregory's husband, deserted her and their small son. In the emergency, her brothers hastily built a small cabin for them. This is the smokehouse. Henry Whitehead's wife died, leaving him with 3 daughters to rear. Henry courted Matilda. He built for them this larger house of square sawed logs. The log sections are 4 inches thick, enough to provide plenty of insulation. At first glance, the building looks like a frame house until you notice the jointed corners. Some call it a transition house, a link between regular log houses and frame houses built of sawed lumber. It is one of 3 such houses in Cades Cove and is the only one left in the park. Dan Lawson built this house in 1856 on land bought from his father-in-law, Peter Cable, whose home stood west across the stream. The brick chimney, unusual for this time and locale, was built of bricks made on the site. Lawson owned a swath of land starting at the Tennessee-North Carolina line on the mountain crest to the south, and coming down the mountain and across the cove and north to the top of Cades Cove Mountain. The original house of hewn logs was built before sawmills came to the cove, but an examination shows that sawed lumber later was used in additions and maintenance. The small building closest to the house is a granary, and another is a smokehouse. The Tipton Place. Colonel Hamp Tipton, who served in the Mexican War, owned property in Cades Cove, but lived in Tuckaleechee Cove. He had this house built in the early 1870s. Among those who lived here were his daughters, Miss Lucy and Miss Lizzie, who taught school in the Cove, and the James McCauley family. The McCauleys rented the place briefly in the late 1870s before James bought land and built his own home. Plus blacksmith and carpentry shops. The blacksmith shop James used here stands nearby in the hollow. The long shed on the opposite side of the house sheltered bee gums. A smokehouse and a woodshed are in the front yard. On the other side of the road stands a double-pen corn crib and a cantilever barn, a replica of an earlier one in the same place. The Carter Shields cabin. A wound suffered at Shiloh left George Washington Carter Shields crippled for life. Shortly after the war, he married and moved to Kansas. He returned to Cades Cove in 1906 and bought this property in 1910. One would think that an old soldier would find contentment in such a lovely nook, but Shields lived here for only 11 years before leaving again. If you liked my video, please comment below. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell. I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to join me again and hit the road with Lisa.